Workaholic CEO meets coffee shop waitress. When she refuses to date him, his life turns upside down. Hello. Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Nathan Wallace had it all. Wealth, power, and a world at his fingertips. His name commanded respect. His presence filled boardrooms with fear, and no one ever dared to say no. Until one ordinary evening, when a simple coffee shop waitress shattered his perfect life with a single word: no. For the first time in his life, Nathan felt something he couldn't control: rejection. It was more than just a bruise to his ego. It was a crack in the flawless image he had built for years. The world as he knew it began to crumble, and with it, the man he thought he was. What happens when the man who has everything meets the one person who refuses to be bought? And how far will he go to prove his worth to someone who sees right through him? In a tale of pride, obsession, and redemption, this isn't just another love story. It's the unraveling of a man who thought he could never be broken. The New York City skyline glittered like a jewel box as night fell, its towering skyscrapers ablaze with light. On the 50th floor of one of those gleaming towers, Nathan Wallace stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, gazing out at the city he'd conquered. At 35, he was one of the youngest CEOs on Wall Street, having clawed his way to the top through sheer ambition and ruthless determination. His designer suit was still crisp despite the late hour, his steel gray eyes sharp and alert even after a grueling 16-hour day. Nathan prided himself on his stamina, on outlasting and outworking everyone around him. It was how he'd built his empire, how he'd amassed his fortune, and it was all he had, was all. As he turned from the window, Nathan caught sight of his reflection. Chiseled features, expertly styled dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples. He looked every inch the powerful executive, but something in his eyes gave him pause, a flicker of emptiness, quickly masked. "Mr. Wallace?" His assistant's tentative voice broke the silence. "It's past 11 p.m. Will you be needing anything else this evening?" Nathan waved her away impatiently. "No, that's all, you can go." Left alone, he sank into his Italian leather chair, suddenly bone-weary. Another successful day of multi-million-dollar deals and corporate machinations. Another night with nothing to show for it but an empty apartment and a bottle of scotch. With a sigh, Nathan gathered his things and headed for the elevator. The thought of his cold, sterile penthouse was suffocating. On impulse, he decided to stop at a nearby coffee shop, one of those cozy neighborhood places that seem to be on every corner in this city. The warm glow from the cafe's windows drew him in like a moth to flame. As Nathan pushed open the door, the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries enveloped him. It was a far cry from the rarefied air of his boardroom, but something about it felt comforting. And then he saw her. She was wiping down a table near the counter, her back to him. Long chestnut hair pulled back in a messy bun, curves accentuated by a simple black t-shirt and jeans. When she turned, Nathan felt the air leave his lungs. Her face was lovely with high cheekbones and full lips, but it was her eyes that captivated him. A warm, deep brown that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. And she was smiling now, a genuine, welcoming expression that made something twist in Nathan's chest. "Hi there, welcome to Joe's, what can I get for you?" Her voice was melodic with just a hint of huskiness. Nathan found himself momentarily tongue-tied, an entirely foreign sensation for a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. He cleared his throat. "Just a black coffee, please. To go." "Coming right up." She turned to pour his drink, and Nathan found his eyes drawn to the graceful line of her neck, the gentle sway of her hips as she moved. When she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed. Nathan felt an electric jolt at the contact. Without thinking, he blurted out, "Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" The words hung in the air between them. Nathan was already envisioning their first date. He'd take her to the most exclusive restaurant in the city, shower her with champagne and caviar. She'd be dazzled by his wealth, impressed by his power. It's how it always went. But then something unprecedented happened. The waitress, Emily according to her name tag, smiled apologetically and shook her head. "I'm flattered, but no thank you. I'm not interested in dating right now." Nathan blinked, sure he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Emily's smile turned a bit strained. "I said no, but thank you for the offer. That'll be $3.50 for the coffee." For a moment, Nathan couldn't process what was happening. He, Nathan Wallace, titan of industry, most eligible bachelor in New York, had just been rejected by a coffee shop waitress. A hot flush of humiliation swept over him. He fumbled for his wallet, nearly dropping it in his haste. As he thrust a $20 bill at her, muttering, "Keep the change," Nathan caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored wall behind the counter. His face was flushed, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked nothing like the confident, powerful man who'd entered the shop just minutes ago. In that moment, Nathan felt utterly exposed, stripped of the armor he'd spent years constructing. Emily's voice, gentle but firm, broke through his daze. "Have a good night, sir." Nathan mumbled something unintelligible and fled the cafe, leaving his untouched coffee on the counter. The cool night air hit him like a slap as he emerged onto the busy sidewalk. He stood there for a long moment, disoriented, as the city swirled around him. How could this have happened? Women never said no to him. Hell, most of them threw themselves at him, eager for a taste of his wealth and status. But this waitress, this Emily, she dismissed him without a second thought. As if he were just another forgettable customer, not Nathan Wallace, the man who had everything. Except, he realized with a jolt, he didn't have everything. Not really. In a daze, Nathan made his way back to his office tower. The gleaming edifice that had always filled him with pride now felt cold and impersonal. As the elevator whisked him back up to the 50th floor, Nathan's mind raced. He'd worked tirelessly for years to build his empire, sacrificing everything: friendships, family, any semblance of a personal life, in pursuit of success. And he'd achieved it, beyond his wildest dreams. So why did he suddenly feel so empty? Nathan stood at his office window once more, gazing out at the glittering city. But now, instead of seeing a kingdom he'd conquered, he saw millions of lives being lived. People connecting, laughing, loving. All the things he'd convinced himself he didn't need or want. Emily's gentle rejection had cracked something open inside him. For the first time in years, Nathan allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loneliness. It crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him gasping. As a single tear slid down his cheek, Nathan made a silent vow. He would see Emily again. He would make her understand who he was. Make her want him. He had to. Because if he couldn't, what did that say about everything he'd built his life on? The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon as Nathan finally left his office. But for him, the night was far from over. It was just the beginning of a journey that would upend everything he thought he knew about himself and what truly mattered in life. Little did he know, his obsession with Emily would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Nathan Wallace strode into the gleaming lobby of Wallace Enterprises, his $5,000 Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. To the casual observer, he appeared every inch the powerful CEO, tailored suit immaculate, chin held high. But beneath the polished exterior, a storm was brewing. Emily's rejection had shaken him to his core, leaving him tossing and turning all night. The few hours of fitful sleep he'd managed were plagued by dreams of her gentle brown eyes and that maddeningly soft no. As he stepped into the elevator, Nathan caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored walls. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, a stark contrast to his usual impeccable appearance. He scowled, straightening his tie with more force than necessary. "Good morning, Mr. Wallace," his assistant chirped as he swept past her desk. "The board is waiting for you in the conference room." Nathan grunted in acknowledgement, barely breaking stride. He pushed open the heavy oak doors, plastering on his best master of the universe expression. "Gentlemen," he began, voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "let's get started." For the next hour, Nathan went through the motions of leading the meeting, but his usual laser focus was nowhere to be found. As his CFO droned on about quarterly projections, Nathan found his mind drifting back to the coffee shop. What was it about Emily that had gotten under his skin? She wasn't the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, though she was certainly attractive. No, it was something else. Something in the way she'd looked at him. Like she saw right through his carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Wallace?" Nathan snapped back to attention, realizing with a jolt that the entire board was staring at him expectantly. "I'm sorry, what was the question?" he asked, struggling to keep the irritation out of his voice. His COO, James, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We were discussing the potential merger with TechCorp. Your thoughts?" Nathan's mind raced. The TechCorp merger, a deal he'd been working on for months. A deal that could potentially double the company's value overnight, and he'd been too distracted to even pay attention. We need more time to review the financials," he said finally, ignoring the confused looks exchanged by his executives. "Let's table this for now and revisit next week." As the meeting adjourned, Nathan could feel the weight of concerned glances on his back. He'd never been unprepared like this before. Never let personal matters interfere with business. Back in his office, Nathan sank into his chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. What the hell was wrong with him? He was Nathan Wallace, for God's sake. He didn't let himself get rattled by anything, least of all some random waitress. And yet, before he could stop himself, Nathan found himself pulling up the coffee shop's website on his computer. There she was, smiling warmly in a staff photo. Emily Chen, it said beneath her picture. His finger hovered over the mouse, tempted to dig deeper. It would be so easy to have his team run a background check, find out everything there was to know about her. Where she lived, her family, her whole life story laid bare with just a few clicks. Nathan jerked his hand back as if burned. What was he thinking? He wasn't some stalker, for Christ's sake. He was better than this, wasn't he? The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, Nathan going through the motions on autopilot. By the time evening rolled around, he felt like a man possessed. He had to see her again, had to understand why her rejection had affected him so deeply. Almost against his will, Nathan found himself back at Joe's coffee shop. His heart raced as he pushed open the door, eyes scanning the cozy interior. And there she was. Emily looked up at the sound of the bell, her welcoming smile faltering slightly as she recognized him. "Oh, hello again," she said, voice carefully neutral. "What can I get for you?" Nathan's carefully prepared speech deserted him. He stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Sir, are you all right?" Coffee, black," Nathan managed to croak out. As Emily turned to pour his drink, Nathan silently berated himself. What was wrong with him? He commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. And here he was, rendered speechless by a coffee shop waitress. When Emily handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed again. This time, Nathan was prepared for the jolt of electricity. What he wasn't prepared for was the flash of something in Emily's eyes. Wariness, curiosity. "That'll be $3.50, she said softly. Nathan fumbled for his wallet, all too aware of how foolish he must look. As he handed over a crisp $100 bill, he blurted out, "Keep the change." Emily's eyes widened. "Sir, I can't accept—" "Please," Nathan interrupted, "I insist." For a long moment they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Emily's shoulders slumped slightly. "Thank you," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but gratitude. As Nathan turned to leave, he heard Emily's voice behind him. "You know, money doesn't solve everything." He froze, hand on the door. Slowly, he turned back to face her. "Excuse me?" Emily met his gaze steadily. "I said money doesn't solve everything, or buy everything. Sometimes people just want to be seen for who they are, not what they can offer." The words hit Nathan like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Without another word, he fled the coffee shop, Emily's words echoing in his ears. As he emerged onto the busy New York street, Nathan felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. For the first time in his adult life, Nathan Wallace, master of the universe, felt completely and utterly lost. The next few days passed in a haze for Nathan. He went through the motions at work, but his mind was constantly drawn back to Emily and her words. Money doesn't solve everything. The phrase haunted him, challenging everything he'd built his life around. As he sat in his corner office, staring unseeing at the Manhattan skyline, Nathan's phone buzzed. It was James, his COO. "Nathan, we need to talk about the Tech Corp deal. The board is getting antsy." Nathan pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'll be right there." In the conference room, tension hung thick in the air. James cleared his throat. "Nathan, what's going on? You've been distracted lately. This merger could make or break us." For a moment, Nathan considered brushing off the concern, falling back on his usual bravado. But something stopped him. Instead, he found himself saying, "I need some time. Personal matters. Can you handle things for a few days?" The shock on James's face would have been comical under other circumstances. Nathan Wallace, workaholic extraordinaire, taking time off? It was unheard of. Back in his office, Nathan made a decision. He had to know more about Emily. Not just surface details, but who she really was. What made her tick? Why she seemed immune to his usual charms. With trembling fingers, he dialed his head of security. "I need you to look into someone for me, discreetly." As he hung up, Nathan felt a twinge of guilt. This was crossing a line he knew, but he couldn't stop himself. The need to understand Emily had become an obsession. Hours later, a thick file landed on his desk. Nathan's hand hovered over it, suddenly hesitant. Did he really want to do this? To invade Emily's privacy so completely? Taking a deep breath, he opened the file. Emily Chen, 28 years old. Born and raised in Queens. Only child of Chinese immigrants. Father deceased, mother battling cancer. Working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Days at the coffee shop, nights as a home health aide. Pursuing a nursing degree part-time. As Nathan read on, a picture emerged of a life so different from his own. A life of struggle, yes, but also of deep compassion and unwavering determination. Emily volunteered at a homeless shelter on her rare days off. She'd put her own dreams on hold to care for her ailing mother. Tears pricked at Nathan's eyes as he reached the end of the file. He felt ashamed. Here he was, a man who had everything, yet felt so empty inside. And Emily, with so little to her name, seemed to have a richness of spirit he could only dream of. In that moment, Nathan made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He would pursue Emily, not as a conquest, but as someone to learn from. Someone who might be able to fill the void he'd only just realized existed within him. But how? She'd already rejected his advances twice. He couldn't simply throw money at the problem. Her words about that had cut too deep. No, he needed a different approach. Something that would allow him to get close to Emily, to understand her world. An idea began to form in Nathan's mind. It was crazy, completely out of character for him. But then again, nothing about this situation was normal. With a sense of both excitement and trepidation, Nathan picked up his phone. "Cancel all my meetings for the next month," he told his assistant, "and find me a cheap apartment in Queens, something ordinary." As he hung up, Nathan caught sight of his reflection in the window. For the first time in years, he saw a spark of life in his own eyes. Whatever happened next, there was no going back now. Little did Nathan know, his decision to step into Emily's world would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about success, and about what truly matters in life. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across his opulent office, Nathan Wallace stood on the precipice of a journey that would either destroy him or save him. The early morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Nathan's rented apartment in Queens. He sat on the edge of a lumpy mattress, running his hands over his face. The sound of car horns and chattering neighbors filtered through the thin walls. A far cry from the hushed luxury of his penthouse. Nathan glanced at his reflection in a cracked mirror. Designer stubble had given way to an unkempt beard, his usually immaculate hair tousled from a restless night. He barely recognized himself. It had been a week since he'd made the impulsive decision to insert himself into Emily's world. A week of skulking around her neighborhood, timing his visits to Joe's coffee shop to coincide with her shifts. He'd exchanged pleasantries, even managed a few brief conversations, but he was no closer to truly understanding her. His phone buzzed incessantly, missed calls and frantic messages from James and the board. The Tech Corp deal was hanging by a thread. Nathan switched it off with a grimace. For the first time in his adult life, work wasn't his top priority. As Nathan made his way to the coffee shop, His mind wandered to the previous day's encounter with Emily. He'd finally worked up the courage to ask about her life outside work. "Oh, you know," she'd said with a tired smile. "Just trying to keep all the plates spinning. Mom's having a rough time with the chemo this round." The vulnerability in her eyes had stirred something in Nathan. Before he could stop himself, he'd blurted out, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Emily's expression had hardened instantly. "I appreciate the offer, but we're managing just fine on our own." Now, as Nathan pushed open the door to Joe's, his heart sank. Emily was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a pimply teenager manned the counter. "Where's Emily?" Nathan demanded more sharply than he'd intended. The kid shrugged, called out sick. Her mom's in the hospital or something. Nathan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Without thinking, he turned and ran out of the shop. He had to find her, had to help somehow. It took several frantic phone calls and a substantial donation to the hospital before Nathan managed to locate Emily. He found her in the oncology ward, slumped in an uncomfortable chair outside her mother's room. "Emily," he said softly. She looked up, eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Confusion flickered across her face. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" I heard about your mom. I wanted to see if you needed anything." Emily's expression darkened. "How did you even know where to find me? Have you been following me?" Nathan felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. "I was worried when you weren't at work. I just wanted to help." "Help?" Emily's voice rose, drawing curious glances from passing nurses. "I told you I don't need your help. I don't need your money. What I need is for you to leave me alone." The vehemence in her voice made Nathan take a step back. "Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "To what? Invade my privacy? Throw your wealth around like it solves everything?" Emily stood, hands clenched at her sides. "You don't know anything about me or my life. Just go." As Emily turned away, disappearing into her mother's room, Nathan stood rooted to the spot. The realization of what he'd done, the lines he'd crossed, hit him like a tidal wave. He stumbled out of the hospital, mind reeling. What had he been thinking? In his obsession to understand Emily, to fill the void in his own life, he'd trampled all over her boundaries. Nathan's phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Nathan, where the hell have you been?" James's voice was frantic. "The TechCorp deal is falling apart. We need you back here now." For a moment, Nathan was tempted to fall back into his old life, to bury himself in work and forget this disastrous attempt at what? Connection? Redemption? But as he opened his mouth to agree, Emily's face flashed in his mind. The pain and anger in her eyes, the weariness etched into every line of her face. I can't, James," Nathan heard himself say. "I have to make something right first." As he hung up, ignoring James's protests, Nathan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in his life, he was putting someone else's needs before his own ambition. He didn't know how, but he had to find a way to make things right with Emily. Not because he wanted anything from her, but because it was the right thing to do. As Nathan hailed a cab, heading back to his rented apartment, he realized that his life had irrevocably changed. The consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. But for the first time in years, Nathan Wallace felt truly alive. The New York skyline loomed before Nathan as his cab inched through midtown traffic. Once those gleaming towers had represented everything he'd worked for. Now they felt like monuments to his hollow existence. His phone buzzed again. James, no doubt. Nathan silenced it with a grimace. The TechCorp deal, his company, his entire empire. It all seemed so insignificant now. As the cab pulled up to Wallace Enterprises, Nathan hesitated. He hadn't planned on coming back to the office, but something compelled him. Perhaps it was time to face the music. The moment he stepped into the lobby, a hush fell over the usually bustling space. Employees stared openly, whispering behind their hands. Nathan caught fragments of conversation. Is that really him? What happened to his suit? I heard he had a breakdown. Head held high, Nathan strode to the elevator. As the doors closed, he caught sight of his reflection. Rumpled clothes, unkempt beard, dark circles under his eyes. He barely recognized himself. The executive floor was a flurry of activity. Nathan's assistant gasped when she saw him. Mr. Wallace, we've been so worried. The board is in emergency session. Nathan brushed past her, pushing open the boardroom doors. The conversation inside ceased abruptly. James stood at the head of the table mid-sentence, his face paled. Nathan, you're here. Sit down, James, Nathan said quietly. We need to talk. For the next hour, Nathan laid bare the truth. His obsession with Emily, his misguided attempts to understand her world, the epiphany he'd had about the emptiness of his own life. As he spoke, he could see the shock and disbelief on his board members' faces. So you see, Nathan concluded, I can't continue like this. I need time to figure things out. Silence reigned for a long moment. Then chaos erupted. You can't be serious. The company will tank without you. Have you lost your mind? James raised a hand, silencing the room. His expression was a mix of concern and disappointment. Nathan, I understand you're going through something, but you have responsibilities. The TechCorp deal. To hell with the deal, Nathan snapped. The vehemence in his voice shocked even him. Don't you see? None of this matters if we're not really living. More silence. Then, slowly, one of the older board members stood. I think, he said carefully, that we need to discuss the future of this company. Without Mr. Wallace present, Nathan nodded, a strange sense of relief washing over him. I understand, I'll clean out my office. As he turned to leave, James caught his arm. Nathan, please, think about what you're throwing away. For a moment, Nathan saw his old self reflected in James's eyes. The ambitious, ruthless man who would stop at nothing to succeed. But that man was gone. I'm not throwing anything away, James, Nathan said softly. I'm finally seeing what's truly valuable. Back in his office, Nathan began emptying his desk. Years of his life condensed into a few cardboard boxes. As he worked, his gaze fell on a framed photo. Himself at the opening of Wallace Enterprises, cocky grin on his face. He'd thought he had it all then. How wrong he'd been. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. His assistant stood in the doorway, eyes brimming with tears. Mr. Wallace, the board, they've asked for your resignation, effective immediately. Nathan nodded, unsurprised. Thank you, Sarah, for everything. As he rode the elevator down for the last time, box of belongings in his arms, Nathan felt a curious lightness. The empire he'd spent his life building was crumbling around him, his reputation in tatters, his future uncertain. And yet, stepping out onto the busy New York street, Nathan took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt free. The path ahead was unclear, but he knew one thing with certainty. He had to make things right with Emily. As he hailed a cab heading towards Queens, Nathan realized that his fall from grace was really just the beginning. The hardest part of his journey, and perhaps the most rewarding, still lay ahead. The glittering towers of Manhattan receded in the rearview mirror, but Nathan didn't look back. His gaze was fixed firmly on the future and the chance at redemption that awaited in a small coffee shop in Queens. The autumn chill nipped at Nathan's face as he stood outside Joe's coffee shop, his heart pounding. It had been a week since his disastrous encounter with Emily at the hospital, a week since he'd walked away from his company. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Nathan pushed open the door. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries washed over him, but this time it brought no comfort. His eyes scanned the shop, searching for Emily. She was there, wiping down tables with quick, efficient movements. When she looked up and saw him, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and tight. "Emily, please," Nathan said, holding up his hands. "I just want to talk, to apologize." For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. Then with a sigh, Emily nodded towards a corner table. 5 minutes, that's all you get." As they sat, Nathan noticed the dark circles under Emily's eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "How's your mother?" he asked softly. Emily's jaw clenched. It's not good. The chemo isn't working like they hoped." Nathan felt a surge of helplessness. All his wealth, all his former power, and he couldn't do a thing to ease this woman's pain. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I know that doesn't help, but..." "Why are you really here, Nathan?" Emily interrupted, her brown eyes boring into his. "What do you want from me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What did he want? He'd been so focused on pursuing Emily, on trying to understand her, that he'd never really stopped to examine his own motivations. I don't know, he admitted, the truth of it surprising even him. When we first met, when you rejected me, it shook something loose inside me. I've spent my whole life thinking success and money were all that mattered. But you made me question everything. Emily's expression softened slightly. So you decided to stalk me and invade my privacy? Nathan winced. I know. I was wrong, so wrong. I've never cared about anyone but myself before. I didn't know how to handle it. As the words left his mouth, Nathan felt the truth of them settle in his chest. He'd been so consumed by his own emptiness, his own need, that he'd trampled all over Emily's life in his misguided attempt to fill the void. I read about you in the paper, Emily said after a long moment. About you leaving your company, was that because of this? Nathan nodded slowly. Partly. But mostly it was because I finally realized how hollow my life had become. I thought I had everything. But really, I had nothing that truly mattered. Emily studied him, her gaze thoughtful. And now? What do you have now? The question hung in the air between them. Nathan looked down at his hands, no longer manicured and soft, but roughened by a week of living in the real world. Now I have hope. Hope that I can become someone better, someone worthy of friendship, of real connection. When he looked up, he was startled to see tears in Emily's eyes. Oh, Nathan, she said softly, you really don't get it, do you? Confusion washed over him. Get what? Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. The gesture, so simple and yet so profound, made Nathan's breath catch. Worthiness isn't something you achieve. It's something you already are. We're all worthy of connection, of love. Even you. The words hit Nathan like a thunderbolt. All his life he'd been striving, achieving, thinking that if he just reached the next goal, gained the next accolade, he'd finally feel complete. But here was Emily, with her simple wisdom, showing him that he'd had it backwards all along. Tears welled in Nathan's eyes, spilling over before he could stop them. Years of pent-up emotion, of loneliness and emptiness came pouring out. Emily squeezed his hand, offering silent support. As his tears subsided, Nathan felt something shift inside him. The wall he'd built around his heart, brick by brick over years of ruthless ambition, began to crumble. I don't know who I am anymore, he whispered, voice raw with emotion. I don't know how to be anything other than what I was. Emily's smile was gentle, understanding. That's okay, nobody has it all figured out. The important thing is that you're trying. As they sat there, hands clasped across the table, Nathan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges he couldn't even imagine. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Outside, the New York City traffic roared on, oblivious to the profound transformation taking place in a small Queens coffee shop. Nathan Wallace, former titan of industry, was taking his first tentative steps towards becoming something far more important, a compassionate human being. The journey ahead would be long and difficult. But with Emily's words echoing in his heart, Nathan finally understood that the most important journey was the one within himself. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Nathan. He spent his days volunteering at the local homeless shelter, his nights poring over nursing textbooks borrowed from Emily. The work was exhausting, often thankless, but Nathan found a sense of fulfillment he'd never known in his corner office. One crisp autumn evening, as Nathan was leaving the shelter, his phone buzzed. It was Emily. Nathan, can you come to the hospital? It's Mom. The fear in her voice sent a chill down Nathan's spine. I'm on my way. At the hospital, Nathan found Emily slumped in a chair outside the ICU, her face pale and drawn. Without a word, he sat beside her, offering silent support. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. They're talking about hospice care, but we can't afford it. I don't know what to do. Nathan's heart ached. He thought of the millions sitting in his bank account, untouched since he'd left Wallace Enterprises. He could easily pay for the best hospice care money could buy, but he knew Emily would never accept such a grand gesture. An idea began to form in his mind. It was risky, potentially disastrous. But as he looked at Emily's tear-stained face, he knew he had to try. "Emily," he said softly, "I might be able to help, but I need you to trust me." She looked at him, hope and wariness warring in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Nathan took a deep breath. "Let me make some calls. I think I can arrange for your mother to get the care she needs, but you can't ask me how. Can you trust me that much?" For a long moment, Emily was silent. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay, I trust you." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Nathan called in every favor he had left, pulled every string he could reach. He arranged for Emily's mother to be transferred to one of the best hospice facilities in the city, all expenses paid. When Emily asked how he'd managed it, Nathan simply shook his head. "Don't worry about it, just focus on your mom." What he didn't tell her was the cost. To make it happen, Nathan had liquidated nearly all of his remaining assets. His penthouse, his cars, his art collection, all gone. But as he watched Emily hold her mother's hand, saw the peace on both their faces, he knew it was worth it. Days turned into weeks. Nathan split his time between the shelter and the hospice, doing whatever he could to support Emily. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams. Nathan found himself opening up in ways he never had before, while Emily's quiet strength continued to inspire him. One evening, as they sat in the hospice garden watching the sunset, Emily turned to Nathan with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know how you did it, but you've given us this time together. It means more than you could ever know." Nathan's heart swelled. He wanted to tell her then, to confess the depth of his feelings, but he held back, knowing it wasn't the right time. A week later, Emily's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. At the small, intimate funeral, Nathan stood by Emily's side, a silent pillar of support. As they walked back to Emily's apartment afterward, she suddenly stopped, turning to face him. "Nathan, I need to know. How did you arrange all this? The hospice care? Everything?" Nathan hesitated, but he knew he owed her the truth. Slowly he explained what he'd done, how he'd sold everything he owned to pay for her mother's care. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "But why? Why would you do that for me?" Nathan took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment of truth. "Because I love you, Emily. Not in the way I thought I did when we first met. Not as something to be won or possessed. I love you for your strength, your compassion, your incredible heart. You've taught me what really matters in life, and I just wanted to give something back." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. For a heart-stopping moment, Nathan thought he'd made a terrible mistake. But then Emily stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "Oh, Nathan," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too." As they stood there on the busy New York street holding each other close, Nathan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He'd lost his fortune, his status, everything he'd once thought important. But he'd gained something far more valuable: love, purpose, and a chance at true happiness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They both had healing to do, challenges to face. But as Nathan looked into Emily's eyes, he knew that together, they could face anything. In that moment, on a crowded sidewalk in Queens, Nathan Wallace, former CEO, current volunteer, and a man forever changed, finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. 6 months had passed since that pivotal moment on the Queens sidewalk. Nathan and Emily's life together was far from the glamorous existence he once led, but it was filled with a richness he'd never known before. They'd moved into a modest apartment, combining Emily's nursing textbooks with Nathan's few remaining possessions. Their evenings were spent studying together, Emily for her nursing exams, Nathan for his newly chosen path in social work. On a warm spring morning, Nathan stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie. It wasn't an expensive silk one like he used to wear, but a simple cotton tie Emily had given him. Today was important, his first day as a counselor at a rehabilitation center for former executives suffering from burnout and addiction. "You ready?" Emily asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. Nathan met her eyes in the mirror, seeing the pride and love shining there. "As I'll ever be," he replied, his voice a mix of nervousness and excitement. As they walked hand in hand towards the subway, Nathan marveled at how much had changed. The streets of New York, once a backdrop to his power plays and business deals, now felt alive with possibility. At the entrance to the rehab center, Emily squeezed his hand. "You've got this," she said softly. "Just remember why you're doing it." Nathan nodded, thinking of all the men and women inside who were versions of his former self. Lost, empty, thinking success and money could fill the void inside them. As he walked through the doors, Nathan was greeted by the center's director, Dr. Martinez. "Mr. Wallace, welcome. Your first group session starts in 10 minutes. Are you prepared?" Taking a deep breath, Nathan nodded. "I am." The room was filled with about a dozen men and women, all wearing expensive suits that seemed at odds with their haunted expressions. Nathan recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror not so long ago. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Nathan Wallace. 6 months ago, I was sitting where you are now. I thought I had it all: money, power, success. But inside, I was empty." As Nathan shared his story, the obsession with Emily, the loss of his company, the journey to find meaning, he saw recognition dawn in the eyes of his listeners. Tears were shed, questions asked. For the first time, many of them were confronting the truth about their own lives. At the end of the session, a woman in her 40s approached Nathan, her mascara smudged from crying. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've been to so many therapists, but none of them really understood. You get it. You've been there." Nathan felt a lump form in his throat. "We're all on this journey together," he said, gently squeezing her shoulder. As he left the center that evening, emotionally drained but deeply fulfilled, Nathan found Emily waiting for him. "How was it?" she asked, linking her arm through his. "Challenging, emotional, but right," Nathan replied. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the setting sun painting the city in warm hues. Suddenly, Emily tugged on his arm, pulling him to a stop. "Nathan," she said, her eyes sparkling with a mix of nervousness and joy. "There's something I need to tell you." His heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Emily took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Nathan stared at Emily, then at his hand on her still flat abdomen, then back at her radiant face. A tidal wave of emotion washed over him. Joy, fear, love, all mixed together. "A baby," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "We're going to be parents." As the reality sank in, Nathan felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. This child, their child, would never know the emptiness he'd experienced. This child would grow up surrounded by love, understanding the true meaning of success. Nathan pulled Emily close, kissing her deeply. When they parted, both had tears in their eyes. "I love you," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." As they continued their walk home, plans and dreams tumbling from their lips, Nathan felt a profound sense of gratitude. His journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and regrets. But it had led him here, to this moment, to this love. Nathan Wallace, once a titan of industry, now stood on the threshold of his greatest adventure yet. As he looked at Emily, her face glowing with happiness, he knew that no amount of money or power could ever compare to the richness of the life they were building together. In that moment, bathed in the golden light of a New York sunset, Nathan finally understood the true meaning of redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about using it to create a better future. And with Emily by his side and their child on the way, the future had never looked brighter.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.